The darkness of space suddenly filled with light as hundreds of massive ships appeared near the edge of the solar system. These were not the sleek vessels of science fiction movies, but battle-scarred warships that had seen centuries of conflict. Their hulls bore the marks of countless fights, repairs, and modifications that spoke of a people who had learned to survive in the harshest conditions imaginable. On the bridge of the largest ship, a man named Jake Harrison stood looking at the view screen with eyes that had seen too much. His hair was gray now, though age worked differently for humans who had spent so long in space. The genetic modifications his people had undergone over the centuries meant he could live much longer than his ancestors ever could, but living longer also meant carrying the weight of memory for much longer too. Jake was the admiral of this fleet, a position he had earned through decades of fighting alien species across the galaxy. Behind him, his officers waited quietly for orders. They all knew what this moment meant. After 500,000 years of wandering through space, humanity had finally returned home. The view screen showed Earth, but it was not the blue and green world their ancestors had known. The planet looked sick. Where once there had been blue oceans, now there were pools of yellow-green liquid that seemed to bubble and move on their own. The continents were covered in strange structures that looked like giant insect nests, rising high into the atmosphere like twisted mountains of bone and flesh. Lisa Turner, the fleet's chief reconnaissance officer, stepped forward with her report. She was younger than Jake, but her eyes held the same hardness that came from years of fighting. Her voice was steady as she spoke, but Jake could hear the anger underneath. "Admiral, our long-range scanners have confirmed what we feared. The Vexi have completely transformed Earth's surface. The atmosphere now contains 60% methane, which means they've changed the very air to suit their biology. Our analysis shows that every natural ecosystem has been destroyed and replaced with their breeding grounds." Jake nodded slowly. He had expected this, but hearing it confirmed still felt like a punch to the gut. The Vexi were insectoid aliens who reproduced by laying eggs in organic matter. Earth had become one giant nursery for their species. Another. Officer Ryan Brooks approached with additional information. He was the fleet's historian, one of the few people who still remembered the stories of old Earth that had been passed down through generations. His job was to keep alive the memory of what humanity had lost. "Sir, based on our observations, we estimate that the Vexi have been using Earth as their primary breeding world for the entire time we've been gone. The structures we're seeing aren't just buildings, they're living hives where their young are raised. Each one could house millions of their kind." Jake closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the stories his grandfather had told him about Earth. Green forests, blue skies, animals that ran free across vast plains. Now all of that was gone, replaced by the alien architecture of their enemies. The story of how humanity had ended up here was simple but tragic. 500,000 years ago, the Vexi had arrived at Earth when humans were still using primitive technology. They had come not as conquerors seeking to rule, but as exterminators seeking to clear the planet for their own use. The few humans who had managed to escape in the handful of spacecraft they possessed had been forced to flee into deep space. Those survivors had spent the next 500,000 years learning, growing, and preparing for this moment. They had encountered other alien species, some friendly and some hostile. They had learned to fight, to adapt, and to survive in environments that would have killed their ancestors. Most importantly, they had never forgotten what had been taken from them. Jake looked around at his bridge crew. These people were the descendants of those original refugees, but they were also something more. Centuries of genetic modification, technological enhancement, and pure necessity had forged them into something that their ancestors could barely recognize as human. They were stronger, faster, and more resilient than any human who had ever lived. "On Earth, what about the surface?" Jake asked. "Are there any signs of the original ecosystem?" Lisa checked her instruments before responding. "No, sir. Our scans show that the Vexi have altered Earth down to the molecular level. The soil itself has been changed to support their biology. Even the water has been contaminated with their organic compounds. If we want to reclaim Earth, we'll need to completely sterilize the planet and rebuild it from scratch. This was not unexpected news, but it was still hard to hear. Jake had hoped that somewhere on Earth some small piece of the original world might have survived, but the Vexhai had been thorough in their destruction. "Sir," another officer interrupted, "we're detecting movement from the planet's surface. It looks like they've noticed our arrival." On the view screen, Jake could see lights beginning to appear on the dark side of Earth. The alien hives were activating their defenses, preparing for what they probably thought would be another minor skirmish with some wandering species. They had no idea that the very people they had driven from this world had returned. Jake smiled, but it was not a pleasant expression. "Good, let them prepare. They've had 500,000 years to enjoy what they stole from us. Now it's time for them to pay the price." He turned to address his entire crew. "All ships maintain position at the edge of the system. Do not engage yet. I want our reconnaissance teams to gather as much information as possible before we begin the reclamation. We've waited this long for our revenge. We can wait a little longer to make sure we do it right." The crew nodded and began preparing for the next phase of their mission. Jake remained on the bridge, staring at the twisted form of his homeworld. Somewhere down there, buried under layers of alien contamination, was the world that had given birth to humanity. His people had traveled across the galaxy, fought impossible battles, and survived against all odds for one simple reason: to come home. But home was not just about returning to a place. It was about reclaiming what had been taken, about making the ones who had taken it pay for their crimes. The Vexhai had shown no mercy to humanity 500,000 years ago. They had driven his people from their world without thought or care, treating them as nothing more than pests to be eliminated. Now humanity had returned, and they were no longer the weak, primitive species that had been so easily defeated. They were something new, something dangerous, something that had been forged in the fires of exile and tempered by centuries of struggle. The Vexhai were about to learn that sometimes the prey comes back as the predator. Jake looked at Earth one more time, then turned to his officers. "Begin Phase 1 of Operation Homecoming. It's time to remind the galaxy what happens when you take something from humanity." 3 days after the fleet's arrival, Amy Rodriguez prepared for the most dangerous mission of her life. She was a colonel in the human military, trained for operations that most people would consider impossible. Her team of 12 soldiers had volunteered for a reconnaissance mission to Earth's surface, knowing that many of them might not return. The shuttle they would use was unlike anything that had existed in the old human civilization. It was covered in advanced stealth technology that could bend light around it, making it invisible to most scanning equipment. The hull was made from materials that had been developed during humanity's long exile, stronger than anything the Vexhai possessed. Amy looked at her team as they prepared their equipment. Each soldier carried weapons that had been designed specifically to kill Vexhai. The aliens had thick, chitinous shells that could stop most projectiles, but human weapons had been modified to punch through their defenses. They also carried biological protection suits that would allow them to survive in Earth's poisoned atmosphere. Pete Collins, the team's biological specialist, checked his sample containers one final time. His job was to collect specimens from Earth's surface, so the fleet's scientists could understand exactly how the planet had been changed. Pete was younger than Amy, but he had spent his entire adult life studying alien biology. He knew more about the Vexhai than almost anyone in the fleet. "Colonel," Pete said, "our analysis suggests that the Vexhai have been modifying Earth's ecosystem for the entire time we've been gone. The changes aren't just surface level, they've altered the planet's chemistry at the molecular level. We need to understand how deep these changes go if we want to reverse them." Amy nodded. She understood the importance of their mission. The human fleet could destroy the Vexhai, but if they couldn't restore Earth to a habitable state, then their victory would be meaningless. They would have reclaimed a dead world that could never support human life again. The shuttle launched from the fleet's main ship under cover of darkness. Earth's night side was illuminated by the strange glow of alien structures. creating an eerie landscape that looked nothing like the world humans had once called home. As they descended through the atmosphere, Amy could see the full extent of the damage where major cities had once stood. Now there were massive hive structures that stretched kilometers into the sky. These were not built buildings, but grown ones, created from some kind of organic material that pulsed with its own life. Between the hives, the ground was covered in a carpet of alien vegetation that moved and shifted even without wind. Grace Mitchell, the team's communications expert, monitored alien transmissions as they approached the surface. She was one of the few humans who had learned to understand the Vexai language during the fleet's travels. Her ability to intercept their communications had proven invaluable in planning attacks on other alien colonies. "Colonel, I'm picking up routine communications from the surface," Grace reported. "It looks like they're treating our arrival as a minor threat. They're not mobilizing their full defenses, which suggests they don't understand what we really are." This was good news. The Vexai had become complacent during their long occupation of Earth. They had faced no serious challenges for hundreds of thousands of years, and their military readiness had declined accordingly. This overconfidence would be one of humanity's greatest advantages in the coming war. The shuttle landed in what had once been the Pacific Ocean. The water was now a thick, yellowish liquid that bubbled and steamed. Pete immediately began collecting samples, his instruments recording data that would be crucial for understanding how to reverse the alien contamination. "This is incredible," Pete whispered into his communicator. "The Vexai haven't just poisoned the water, they've completely replaced it with their own biological fluids. This isn't an ocean anymore, it's a giant breeding pool." Amy felt sick as she watched alien creatures swimming through the toxic water. These were not the Vexai themselves, but some kind of intermediate life form that served as food for their young. The entire ecosystem had been designed to support the alien reproduction cycle. The team moved inland, using their stealth technology to avoid detection. What they found was even worse than they had expected. The ground itself was alive, covered in a network of organic tubes that pulsed with flowing liquids. These tubes connected all the hive structures, creating a planet-wide circulatory system. "It's like the entire planet has been turned into a single living organism," Amy reported back to the fleet. "The Vexai haven't just occupied Earth, they've transformed it into an extension of their own biology." As they moved deeper into the alien landscape, Grace detected something unexpected. Her communication equipment was picking up transmissions that were not in the Vexai language. They were in an old form of human speech, heavily distorted but still recognizable. "Colonel, I think there are humans down here," Grace said with excitement. "The transmissions are coming from underground, probably from some kind of bunker system." Amy felt a surge of hope. If humans had survived on Earth during the long occupation, they might have valuable intelligence about the Vexai defenses. More importantly, they represented a connection to the original human civilization that had been lost. Following Grace's guidance, the team located the source of the transmissions. Hidden beneath layers of alien growth, they found an entrance to an underground complex. The security systems were primitive by the fleet's standards, but they were recognizably human in design. The team descended into the bunker, their weapons ready for anything. What they found was a small community of humans who had been living underground for centuries. These people were the descendants of survivors who had hidden when the Vexai first arrived. They had managed to avoid detection by building their homes deep beneath the surface. The leader of these survivors was a woman named Carol Bennett. She was older than Amy, her hair white from decades of living in the underground darkness. But her eyes were sharp and intelligent, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had fought for survival every day of her life. "You're from the fleet," Carol said. It was not a question. "We've been monitoring your communications since you arrived. We've been waiting for this day for a very long time." Amy was amazed by what she learned from Carol and her people. The underground humans had not just survived. They had been actively working to undermine the Vexai occupation. They had learned to move through the alien tunnel systems. to sabotage their equipment and to gather intelligence about their defenses. We've been preparing for your return, Carol explained. Every generation we've passed down the knowledge of how to fight the Vexhai. We know their weaknesses, their patrol patterns, their breeding cycles. We've been waiting for the day when we could finally strike back. The underground humans had also preserved something precious, genetic samples from Earth's original ecosystem. Hidden in secret vaults, they had maintained frozen samples of plants and animals that had existed before the alien occupation. This meant that if the Vexhai could be defeated, it might be possible to restore some of Earth's natural life. Pete was excited by this discovery. Colonel, if we can combine their genetic samples with our terraforming technology, we might be able to reverse the ecological damage. It won't be easy, but it's possible. Amy spent several hours with Carol's people, learning about the alien defenses and sharing information about the fleet's capabilities. The underground humans had detailed maps of the Vexhai tunnel systems, information about their military installations, and knowledge of their weaknesses that could prove crucial in the coming battle. As the reconnaissance team prepared to return to the fleet, Carol made a request. We want to fight alongside you when the time comes. We've been hiding for too long. When you attack, we'll sabotage their defenses from within. Amy nodded. These people had earned the right to participate in the liberation of their world. They had kept the flame of human resistance alive through the darkest period in their species' history. The shuttle lifted off from Earth's surface, carrying with it not just intelligence about the enemy, but hope for the future. The planet could be reclaimed, the ecosystem could be restored, and humanity could finally come home. But first, they would have to fight the most important battle in their species' history. Deep beneath the surface of Earth, in a chamber that pulsed with organic light, something stirred. Zekthal, the hive commander of the Vexhai forces on Earth, had been sleeping for nearly a century. His species did not need to remain active at all times like humans did. Instead, they entered long periods of dormancy, waking only when their presence was required. The chamber around him was alive, its walls breathing slowly as they filtered the methane-rich atmosphere. Zekthal's body was massive, nearly 3 meters tall, with 6 arms that ended in razor-sharp claws. His head was dominated by compound eyes that could see in multiple spectrums of light, and his mandibles could crush steel with ease. A smaller Vexhai worker approached him, its movements quick and nervous. The worker's body trembled as it delivered its report. Hive Commander, the sensors have detected unknown vessels at the edge of the system. They appeared suddenly, as if they had been hiding in the void. Zekthal's eyes focused on the worker. In the 500,000 years since the Vexhai had claimed Earth, no species had ever dared to approach their home system. The few alien races that had discovered Earth's location had quickly learned to stay away after encountering the Vexhai military. How many vessels? Zekthal asked, his voice creating vibrations that could be felt through the organic walls. Hundreds, Hive Commander. They are large, heavily armed, and their technology is unlike anything in our databases. Our analysts believe they may be from a species we have not encountered before. Zekthal rose from his resting position, his massive form towering over the worker. The idea of an unknown threat approaching Earth was both interesting and concerning. The Vexhai had spent centuries cataloging every known species in the galaxy. They kept detailed records of potential threats and had eliminated most of them long ago. Show me, Zekthal commanded. The worker led him to a viewing chamber where holographic displays showed the human fleet. The ships were indeed unlike anything in the Vexhai databases. They were clearly built for war, with heavy armor and weapon systems that appeared to be designed for close combat. Most alien species preferred to fight from long range, but these vessels seemed prepared for brutal, direct confrontation on the human fleet. Steve Parker was monitoring the alien communications. As the fleet's intelligence officer, his job was to understand enemy movements and intentions. The specialized equipment his team used could intercept and translate most alien languages, including the complex chemical signals the Vexhai used to communicate. Admiral, we're detecting increased activity from the surface, Steve reported to Jake Harrison. "It looks like their command structure is waking up. They're trying to identify us, but their databases don't have any information about human technology." Jake smiled grimly. This was exactly what he had hoped to hear. The Vex-High had been so thorough in their destruction of human civilization that they had erased all records of humanity from their files. To them, humans were an extinct species that posed no threat. "What's their current assessment of our fleet?" Jake asked. Steve checked his instruments. "They're treating us as a potential threat, but not an immediate one. They're activating their defensive systems, but they're not mobilizing their full military. They think we're just another alien species looking for trouble." This was perfect. The Vex-High's arrogance and ignorance would be their downfall. They had no idea that the very species they had driven from Earth had returned, transformed by centuries of warfare into something far more dangerous than they had ever been. Meanwhile, Helen Davis was working on a different aspect of the mission. As the leader of the fleet's psychological warfare division, her job was to understand the enemy's mental state and find ways to exploit their weaknesses. She had been studying Vex-High psychology for decades, preparing for this moment. "Admiral, I've been analyzing their communication patterns," Helen reported. "The Vex-High show classic signs of a species that has become too comfortable. They've had no serious challenges for hundreds of thousands of years, and their military readiness has declined significantly." This was valuable information. An enemy that had grown soft from centuries of easy victories would be unprepared for the kind of warfare humanity had learned during their exile. The humans had fought desperate battles against impossible odds, learning to survive through cunning, determination, and sheer ruthlessness. "There's something else," Helen continued. "Their records show that they've completely forgotten about humanity. When they conquered Earth, they didn't just destroy our civilization. They erased all memory of it. To them, we never existed." Jake felt a cold anger building in his chest. The Vex-High had not just taken Earth, they had tried to erase humanity from history itself. This made their coming revenge even more satisfying. The aliens were about to be destroyed by a species they had forgotten ever existed on Earth's surface. Carol Bennett and her underground resistance were preparing for their role in the coming battle. The reconnaissance team had shared information about the fleet's capabilities, and Carol's people were ready to act when the time came. "Listen carefully," Carol told her assembled fighters. "We've waited our entire lives for this moment. Our parents waited, and their parents before them. Every generation of our people has dreamed of the day when we could finally strike back at the creatures that stole our world." The underground humans had spent centuries preparing for this day. They had mapped every tunnel system, identified every weak point in the alien defenses, and developed weapons that could hurt the Vex-High. Most importantly, they had maintained the human spirit of resistance that the aliens thought they had destroyed. Back in the alien command center, Zechthel was growing increasingly concerned about the unknown fleet. His military advisors had run every possible analysis, but they could not identify the species or predict their intentions. The ships remained at the edge of the system, neither advancing nor retreating. "Perhaps they are explorers," suggested one of his sub-commanders. "Many species send scouts to examine our defenses before deciding whether to challenge us." Zechthel was not convinced. There was something different about these ships, something that made his instincts scream warnings. In all his centuries of existence, he had never encountered vessels that radiated such focused hostility. "Double the surface patrols," he ordered, "and activate the deep space sensors. I want to know if there are more ships hiding in the outer system." The Vex-High began increasing their defensive preparations, but they were still thinking in terms of conventional warfare. They expected their enemies to announce their intentions, to negotiate, or to attack obvious targets. They had no concept of the kind of total warfare that humanity had learned to practice. Billy Johnson, the commander of the fleet's fighter squadrons, was putting the finishing touches on his attack plans. His pilots had trained for this mission their entire lives, flying simulations of attacks on Earth-like targets. Every fighter in the fleet was equipped with weapons designed specifically to penetrate Vex-High defenses. All squadrons, final equipment. Check, Billy announced over the communication system. We launch in 6 hours. Remember, this isn't just another mission. We're going home. The fighter pilots understood the significance of their mission. They were not just soldiers fighting for territory or resources. They were the descendants of refugees returning to reclaim their ancestral home. Every shot they fired would be fired in the name of ancestors who had died in exile, dreaming of a day when humanity would return to Earth. As the hours passed, both sides prepared for the conflict that was about to begin. The Vexai, confident in their superiority, made ready to defend what they considered their rightful territory. The humans, driven by centuries of anger and determination, prepared to reclaim what had been stolen from them. Neither side fully understood what the other was capable of. The Vexai had grown complacent and overconfident. The humans had been forged by desperation and hardship into something their ancestors could never have imagined. When these two forces finally met in battle, the outcome would reshape the galaxy forever. The waiting was almost over. Soon the Vexai would learn that some species never forgive and some wrongs can never be forgotten. Humanity had returned and they had come for revenge. The first shot of the war came without warning. Admiral Jake Harrison had waited 3 days for the perfect moment, and now it had arrived. The Vexai patrol ships were in their usual formation, lazy and predictable after centuries of facing no real threats. Jake gave the signal, and the human fleet suddenly came alive with deadly purpose. Tony Williams was piloting the destroyer Vengeance when the attack began. He had been born on a refugee ship during humanity's long exile, and had never seen Earth except in old pictures. Now, as his ship's weapons tore through the first Vexai vessel, he felt a surge of satisfaction that had been building his entire life. Target destroyed, Tony reported calmly into his communicator. Around him, dozens of other human ships were engaging the alien patrol fleet. The Vexai had been caught completely off guard, their ships scattered and confused by the sudden assault. The alien vessels were larger than the human ships, but they were not built for the kind of close-range combat that humanity had perfected. The Vexai preferred to fight from a distance, using their superior numbers to overwhelm enemies. But the humans had learned to fight like cornered animals, getting close enough to strike at vital systems before their enemies could react. On the bridge of his flagship, Jake watched the battle unfold with cold satisfaction. The first phase of the attack was going exactly as planned. The Vexai orbital defenses were being systematically destroyed, clearing the way for the ground assault. Admiral, the enemy is trying to form a defensive line around the planet, reported one of his officers. They're moving their heavy cruisers into position, Jake nodded. This was expected. The Vexai might be overconfident, but they were not stupid. Once they realized the scale of the attack, they would try to protect their most important assets on Earth's surface. Signal the second wave, Jake ordered. Begin the planetary bombardment. On Earth's surface, Zechthel felt the ground shake. As the first human weapons struck the planet, the attack was unlike anything he had experienced before. Most alien species targeted military installations or population centers, but these attackers seemed to be hitting biological targets, the very foundations of Vexai life on Earth. Hive Commander, they're targeting our breeding facilities, reported a panicked sub-commander. They're not trying to conquer the planet, they're trying to sterilize it. Zechthel's compound eyes widened in shock. This was not normal warfare. These attackers were not interested in capturing territory or resources. They were trying to completely eliminate the Vexai presence on Earth. This suggested a level of hatred that went beyond simple territorial disputes. Who are they? Zechthel demanded. What species fights with such fury? But his advisors had no answers. The attacking ships used technology that was not in any of their databases. The weapons were clearly designed to cause maximum damage to Vexai biology, but no known species had such detailed knowledge of their weaknesses. Underground, Carol. Bennett felt the vibrations from the orbital bombardment and knew the moment had finally arrived. She gathered her resistance fighters in the main tunnel system, their faces grim with determination. They had waited their entire lives for this chance to strike back. "The fleet is attacking the surface installations," Carol announced. "This is our signal to begin the sabotage operations. Remember, we know these tunnels better than the Vexi do. Use that advantage." The underground humans split into small groups, each with a specific target. Some would attack the alien communication systems. Others would sabotage their power generation, and a few would try to reach the most important breeding chambers. They all knew that many of them would not survive, but they also knew that this was their only chance to free their world. Above ground, Colonel Amy Rodriguez was leading the first wave of human ground forces. Her troops had been specially trained for fighting in the poisoned environment of occupied Earth. Their armor was sealed against the toxic atmosphere, and their weapons were designed to punch through Vexi defenses. "Remember, we're not just fighting for territory," Amy told her soldiers as their landing craft approached the surface. "We're fighting to reclaim our home. Every building, every piece of ground, every breath of air on this planet belongs to humanity. The Vexi are the invaders here, not us." The landing was chaotic and violent. The Vexi ground forces, led by a sub-commander named Carinth, had prepared defensive positions around their most important installations. But they had prepared for conventional warfare, not the kind of desperate assault that humanity was launching. The human soldiers fought with a fury that shocked their enemies. They took risks that seemed suicidal, charging directly into enemy fire to reach their targets. But these were not desperate acts. They were the tactics of a species that had learned to survive against impossible odds. Nancy White, the fleet's chief engineer, was coordinating the deployment of specialized weapons from orbit. Her team had spent decades developing tools that could reverse the biological contamination of Earth as the battle raged below. Her atmospheric processors began working to neutralize the alien modifications to the planet's air. "Admiral, the atmospheric processors are online," Nancy reported. "We're beginning to see results in the targeted areas. The methane levels are dropping and oxygen is starting to return to normal levels." This was crucial to the long-term success of the mission. Even if humanity could defeat the Vexi, Earth would remain uninhabitable unless the atmospheric damage could be reversed. Nancy's work was making it possible for humans to actually live on their homeworld again, on the surface. The battle was becoming more intense. The Vexi were fighting with the desperation of a species that was beginning to realize it might actually lose. Their warriors were individually stronger than humans, but they were not prepared for the coordinated assault they were facing. Pete Collins, the biological specialist who had been part of the original reconnaissance mission, was now leading a team of scientists in the field. Their job was to identify and neutralize the alien biological weapons that the Vexi were deploying. In their desperation, Colonel Rodriguez were detecting airborne toxins in Sector 7, Pete reported. "The Vexi are releasing biological agents that could kill our troops even through their protective suits." This was a dangerous development. The Vexi had spent centuries developing biological weapons based on their understanding of Earth's ecosystem. If they could deploy these weapons effectively, they might be able to stop the human advance despite their other disadvantages. But Pete and his team were ready for this challenge. They had brought their own biological weapons, viruses and bacteria, that had been engineered specifically to attack Vexi biology. As the aliens released their toxins, the humans responded with biological warfare of their own. The underground resistance was having success with their sabotage operations. Carol Bennett's people had managed to disable several key communication nodes, making it difficult for the Vexi to coordinate their defense. They had also damaged several power generation facilities, causing blackouts in important areas. "Carol, we've reached the primary breeding chamber," reported one of her team leaders. "The facility is lightly defended. Most of their forces are fighting the surface battle." This was the moment Carol had been waiting for. The breeding chambers were the heart of the Vexi presence on Earth. If they could be destroyed, it would deal a devastating blow to the alien ability to maintain their population. "Plant the charges," Carol ordered. "Maximum yield." I want that facility completely destroyed. The explosion could be felt throughout the underground complex. Millions of Vex-High eggs and larvae were destroyed in an instant, dealing a blow to their species that would take centuries to recover from. But more importantly, it was a symbolic victory for humanity. They had struck at the very heart of the alien occupation. As the battle continued, it became clear that the tide was turning in humanity's favor. The Vex-High were brave fighters, but they were not prepared for the kind of total warfare that the humans were waging. Every human soldier, from the lowest private to Admiral Harrison himself, was fighting with the fury of someone who had been denied their birthright for too long. The war for Earth had begun, and humanity was winning. The final battle for Earth took place in the ruins of what had once been New York City, where skyscrapers had once reached toward the sky. Now stood a massive Vex-High biofortress that towered over the landscape like a twisted mountain of flesh and bone. This was the heart of the alien occupation, the central command structure that controlled their entire empire on Earth. Admiral Jake Harrison stood in the command center of his flagship, watching the assault unfold on the main screen. After days of fighting, the human forces had pushed the Vex-High back to their last stronghold. Now came the most dangerous part of the mission, the final assault that would determine the fate of both species. Admiral, our ground forces are in position around the biofortress, reported Colonel Amy Rodriguez through the communication system. The structure is heavily defended, but our intelligence suggests that the Vex-High leadership is trapped inside. If we can take it, we can end this war, Jake nodded grimly. He had made a decision that surprised many of his officers. Instead of directing the battle from orbit, he was going to lead the final assault personally. This was too important to leave to others. After 500,000 years of exile, he wanted to be the one to reclaim Earth's most important city. Prepare my shuttle, Jake ordered. I'm going down there. His officers protested, but Jake's mind was made up. This was not just a military operation, it was the culmination of humanity's long journey home. He needed to be there when it ended. On the surface, Kevin Brown was leading his assault team through the outer defenses of the biofortress. As a captain in the elite forces, he had been chosen for the most dangerous part of the mission, penetrating the fortress and clearing the way for Admiral Harrison's arrival. The inside of the fortress was like something from a nightmare. The walls were alive, pulsing with alien blood vessels that glowed with sickly light. The floors were covered in a carpet of organic matter that felt soft and wet under their boots. Worst of all were the trophies that lined the corridors, preserved human remains that the Vex-High had kept as reminders of their conquest. "Captain, we're finding human remains throughout the structure," reported one of Kevin's soldiers, his voice tight with anger. "They've been keeping pieces of our ancestors like decorations." Kevin felt a cold rage building in his chest. The sight of these preserved humans, displayed like hunting trophies, reminded him why this war was necessary. The Vex-High had not just conquered Earth, they had treated humanity like animals to be hunted and displayed. "Keep moving," Kevin ordered. "We'll mourn our dead after we've avenged them." Deep in the heart of the fortress, Vexmore, the supreme overlord of the Vex-High Empire, prepared for his final battle. He was ancient even by the standards of his species, having ruled Earth for over 300,000 years. His body was massive, easily 4 meters tall, with armor-like skin that had been hardened by centuries of genetic modification. Around him, his personal guard made their own preparations. These were the elite of the Vex-High military, warriors who had been bred specifically for combat. They had never known defeat, and they did not intend to start now. "Supreme Overlord, the human forces have breached the outer defenses," reported one of his advisors. "They are fighting their way toward the command center." Vexmore's compound eyes focused on the tactical display. The human assault was unlike anything he had ever seen. Instead of trying to capture territory or negotiate surrender, they were systematically destroying everything in their path. This was not conquest, it was extermination. "Who are these creatures?" Vexmore asked. "What species fights with such hatred?" But even now, with his empire crumbling around him, he did not understand what he was facing. The Vexhai had erased humanity so completely from their records that they could not comprehend that their former victims had returned for revenge. Admiral Harrison's shuttle landed near the fortress, just as Kevin Brown's team reached the inner chambers. Jake emerged from the craft wearing full combat armor, carrying weapons that had been designed specifically for fighting Vexhai leadership. Behind him came a small team of his most trusted officers, including Colonel Rodriguez and the Underground Resistance leader Carol Bennett. "Admiral, the path to the command center is clear," Kevin reported as Jake's team joined the assault. "But we're detecting massive Vexhai biosignatures ahead. Their leadership is making a final stand." Jake checked his weapons one last time. After all these years of planning and preparation, he was finally going to face the creatures that had driven his people from their home. Then let's finish this. The final assault on the command center was brutal and chaotic. The Vexhai elite guard fought with desperate fury, knowing that defeat meant the end of their species' dominance. But they were facing humans who had been forged by centuries of warfare. Led by officers who had spent their entire lives preparing for this moment, Carol Bennett fought alongside the fleet soldiers, her weapons cutting down alien warriors with deadly precision. She had waited her entire life for this moment, the chance to strike back at the creatures that had murdered her ancestors and stolen her world. "For every human who died in the tunnels," she shouted as she fired at the enemy, "for every child who never saw the sun, for 500,000 years of stolen dreams." The battle raged through the corridors of the biofortress, human and alien warriors locked in deadly combat. The Vexhai were individually stronger, but the humans fought with a coordination and determination that their enemies could not match. Finally, Jake Harrison found himself face to face with Exmoor in the heart of the command center. The alien Supreme Overlord towered over him, his massive form seeming to fill the entire chamber. But Jake felt no fear, only the cold satisfaction of a job nearly finished. "You have fought well for primitives," Dexmore said in his broken understanding of human speech. "But you cannot defeat the Vexhai Empire. We have ruled 1,000 worlds for 1,000,000 years." Jake raised his weapon, its energy systems humming. "With deadly power, we're not primitives. We're the species you tried to exterminate. We're the ones whose home you stole. We're humans, and we've come back." The recognition in Nexmoor's compound eyes was immediate and terrible. In that moment, he finally understood what he was facing. These were not random aliens seeking conquest. They were the children of Earth, returned from exile to reclaim their birthright. "Impossible," Nexmoor whispered. "The humans are extinct." "We destroyed them all." "You missed a few," Jake replied, and pulled the trigger. The weapon's energy beam punched through Exmoor's armor like it was paper. The massive alien leader crashed to the floor, his body convulsing as his life systems failed. With his dying breath, he managed to ask one final question. "Why did you return? Why did you not stay in the darkness where we sent you?" Jake looked down at the dying creature with no pity in his eyes. "Because this is our home, and nobody takes our home from us." With Exmoor's death, the Vexhai resistance collapsed. The remaining aliens on Earth either fled or were systematically hunted down and eliminated. The biofortress began to die as its organic systems shut down without their controlling intelligence. Days later, Jake Harrison stood with Carol Bennett on what had once been the observation deck of the Empire State Building. The alien growth that had covered the structure was being removed by human engineering teams, revealing the steel and stone underneath. For the first time in 500,000 years, natural sunlight was beginning to penetrate Earth's atmosphere, as the atmospheric processors completed their work. "It's beautiful," Carol said, watching the sun rise over a world that was slowly becoming human again. "I never thought I would live to see clean air and blue skies." Jake nodded, but his expression remained serious. The victory had come at a terrible cost. Billions of humans had died during the long exile, never seeing their homeworld again. The Earth they had reclaimed was damaged almost beyond recognition, and it would take generations to fully restore it. The Vexhai Empire still controls thousands of other worlds, Jake said. They have enslaved countless species across the galaxy. Our work here is just the beginning. Carol looked at him with understanding. The war for Earth was over, but the war for the galaxy was just beginning. Humanity had learned hard lessons during their exile. They had become something stronger and more dangerous than their ancestors. Now they had the tools and the will to ensure that what happened to Earth would never happen to any other world. The other enslaved species will need our help, Carol said. Jake smiled, but it was not a gentle expression. Then we'll help them. The Vexi wanted to make us extinct. Instead, they made us into something they should have feared. Now the galaxy will learn what happens when you threaten humanity. The sun continued to rise over Earth, casting light on a world that was finally free. But in the depths of space, human ships were already preparing for the next phase of their mission. The age of Vexi dominance was ending, and the age of human expansion was about to begin. Earth was home again, but humanity had been forever changed by their long journey through the darkness. They had learned that in the vastness of space, only the strong survive, and they had become the strongest of all.